Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be going over the spike timing dependent plasticity linear versus Susan Shore device study results section of the recent Dirk de Ridder Goes Beyond the Basics interview conducted by me on Tinnitus Quest. Now, I would like to once again extend my deep gratitude to the Tinnitus Quest team, Marku and Hazel, and of course to Dirk de Ridder for pushing through this massive 5-hour Q&A session. So let's get down to it. Now, how we're going to go about this is I will play the part of the section that we are interested in for this specific video, and then I will pause the Q&A and I will add my own commentary to what was being said. Now, I recommend everybody to visit the full Q&A link in the description to watch the entire thing if you do have the time. But even if you do not have the time, the Q&A is organized into distinct sections, which you can watch and, access at your own disposal.
So then here is some of the studies and why these are the two more recent studies, and why is it important to try and read studies is because it helps you to put things into perspective. We can start with Susan Shore's device or the tongue stimulation. It doesn't really matter. They both have their strengths and both have their weaknesses. First of all, Susan Shore's work, but also the tongue stimulation is based on animal studies and specific mechanisms that really predict what you should do, but more even for Susan Shore's device, because the timing is extremely important. That if you have this spike timing dependent plasticity, then you have to combine the sound and the electrical stimulation in a specific way. Now, if this would be the common mechanism for everybody with somatosensory modulated tinnitus, then you would expect very robust and very strong results.
Now, Dirk de Ridder does make a valid point here from a clinician's perspective. However, from a scientist's perspective, which by the way will be mentioned later on in this Q&A, the principles of spike timing dependent plasticity are absolute. So that's just how our neurons respond to specific timings of the spikes of the pre- and postsynaptic neurons. Now, regardless of what a clinician may think about this, these principles exist in every single person, regardless of whether or not the person has somatosensory modulations. A person who has somatosensory modulations, what this does actually show is that the person has a stronger synaptic connection between the fusiform cells of the dorsal cochlear nucleus and the parallel fibers of the granule cells of the somatosensory pathway. Now, just because a person does not have a strong connection between them does not mean that this connection does not exist. This connection exists in every single person on the planet. That's just how our auditory processing works in our bodies. So even if a person does not have such a strong connection, being able to influence their tinnitus volume with somatosensory modulations does not mean that this connection does not exist and that this treatment is not going to work for them. Will the treatment be less effective for those who do not have this strong connection between the fusiform cells of the dorsal cochlear nucleus and the parallel fibers of the granule cells of the somatosensory pathways? Well, with current data that we have right now, we don't know. But making a scientific assumption that it will help is not baseless. These connections, as I've mentioned before, do exist regardless of the fact of how strong they are. And by all logic, people who do not have very obvious somatosensory modulations still should see benefit from using the device. just they would have to use it for much longer than those who do not. Now, again, this is just an assumption, and hopefully my more recent trials that I'm currently conducting with over 200 participants will show some very good data on this.
However, if you look at the data with an intention to treat, which means that you look at the analysis of everybody, whether they've finished the treatment or not, and the assumption is that most of the people, not all, but most of the people in the trial will actually stop because they don't see a benefit. So you should kind of count them to the negative results and therefore also include the negative results. So that's the purpose of the intention to treat, rather than the treatment. For example, if you start with 100 patients and only 14 finish, and all 14 or do well, then you can say this is a brilliant treatment. Yeah, but only for 14 patients, because there was 86 who stopped because they might not have had a benefit result. So that's the goal of the intention to treat. Now,
I don't fully agree with Dirk here. There can be many reasons why a person drops out of the trial, not only because he does not perceive a benefit. For example, if a person does not want to stick to the strict regime of the trial, they can drop out. If a person just goes on a trip, they can drop out. If a person has anything happening in their life that prevents them from daily usage of the device, they can also drop out. Another reason is also laziness. And as we saw in my previous trials, the ones that I posted on my subreddit and made a video about, we can actually see that persistence is key. So if a person persists with the treatment until the very end, then they follow the protocol. Also, if a person follows the protocol, in other words, no going to concerts, no stimulants, anything that can affect the treatment efficacy. If a person does not persist with the treatment, then their data becomes corrupted if they go off protocol. Now, if we take a look at Susan's trial, there were people who dropped out, but there was also people who went to a concert and many other things. So the problem with such large-scale trials for the general population, especially the population that does not have severe or catastrophic tinnitus, hyperacusis, those who can go anywhere and do anything anytime they want, well, that's going to introduce a lot of issues, because these people are not motivated enough to stick to the treatment protocol. And that means they can, enjoy a glass of brandy in the evening, or they can listen to their favorite tunes. And as we all know, all of this can actually throw the process of long-term synaptic depression into whack, so to speak, potentially reducing the efficacy, because a very stable, an exceptionally stable environment is necessary for the induction of long-term depression to occur. Because as I've explained in my previous videos, the AMPA receptors that are removed from the cell membrane, they are not removed permanently, immediately. They are placed inside the cell, so to speak, and before they are dissolved, a certain amount of time must pass. And if the person partakes in, any type of stimulants, whether that be noise or coffee or just anything, that destabilizes his intracellular environment, and not only that, but also destabilizes his neurotransmitter activity, then these AMPA receptors are just going to pop right back out onto the cell membrane, and the treatment will have been negated. The fact that Susan Shore's trial participants were not limited in any way is actually very impressive, that she still got such amazing results, especially in the objective volume reduction. Now, I can understand why Susan Shore would not implement this or very strict protocols, because you can imagine that a bunch of people, well, if they have to sit at home all day not doing anything for 6 weeks, well, obviously that's not going to sound very attractive to them. And she had to make sacrifices of efficacy to make sure that the treatment was completed by at least a significant majority of the participants.
If you look at, you can look at loudness and you can look at suffering. So if you look at the loudness results, you see that there is a benefit in the green dots that is clearly more than in the control group who had only auditory stimulation. Now, if you look, the problem here is that it measures the changes in loudness in decibels. So it's a minimum masking level, and this does not correlate with subjectively perceived loudness. So for a clinician, that is difficult because they say, well, what does it tell me? How can I can't tell my patient that the tinnitus will sound 10 decibels less loud because that does not correlate with the subjective loudness level. Now, this is not Susan Shore's fault. This is the fault of the FDA, who required her to do these, to take these outcome measures. And this is, of course, driven by audiologists, maybe academic audiologists, or people who like numbers that can be repeatable. And but that's not always the clinically best. And we looked at that from the brain point of view, and the minimum masking level has no neural correlate whatsoever. Whereas the subjective loudness perception, like if you ask on a scale from 0 to 10 or from 0 to 100, how loud do you perceive it, does correlate with certain brain activity.
Okay, I don't really understand what De Ridder meant here. He says that there is no neural correlate to objective loudness reduction, which is absolutely just not true, because obviously a decrease in loudness would mean a decrease in the synaptic strength between the fusiform cells and, for example, the somatosensory pathways as well. What I think he meant here is that at the moment, there is no reliable way to measure tinnitus subjective tinnitus severity, specifically with things like brain scans and whatnot. Hopefully this is going to change with Bionic Institute's diagnostic tool for measuring objective tinnitus severity that they are currently working on. And regarding his comment on decibels, I think it's very easy to explain a patient that their tinnitus is reduced by 10 decibels. This is something that audiologists are all about. They're all about decibels, like in hearing loss, for example. A 10 decibel decrease means the sound intensity is 1/10 of its original intensity. But if we're talking about perceived loudness, a 10 decibel reduction would be generally perceived as half as loud. I think an audiologist would be able to comprehend what this means, and I think it's rather simple in explaining to a patient.
Now, so the loudness measure is unfortunately not the most optimal for a clinician. Maybe for a scientist it is, but not for a clinician. Now, if you look at the subjective improvement, then what you see is that the benefit on the TFI and the THI, which are two questionnaires that look at the suffering or the distress associated with tinnitus, then you see a benefit of minus 12 points on the TFI and minus 5 points on the THI. Now, the way that scientists try to figure out, well, is this clinically beneficial or not, is by using something that's called the MCID, which is the minimally clinically important difference. But you can compute that in 4 different ways from a computational point of view, and they all give different results. Now, the MCID, so the minimum benefit you should have to be relevant is 13 points. And Susan Shore's device has a benefit of 12 points, which is just at the edge of being clinically relevant, but only minimally clinically relevant according to the definition. The THI is the same, 5 points of benefit on the intention to treat versus an MCID of minus 7. So what does it tell us? Well, it tells us that these scores, or scores out of 100, Now, that means you got about between 5 and 10% benefit. Now, if I'm a patient and I suffer, just to put it in simple figures, and my suffering score is 90, and I go to 78, I'm still suffering severely. So this is not something that, and these are averages, of course, but this is not something that you think, okay, this is going to be the big breakthrough where everybody goes from 90 to 30. No, it gives more or less a 10% benefit. And this is the same benefit that you see from cognitive behavioral therapy, the same benefit that you see from acupuncture, the same benefit that you see from TMS, the same benefit that you see from TTCS. So whatever we do, we seem to arrive at about 10% benefit in suffering scores. And this is clearly not enough. It might be enough if you have a score of 5 and you can drop to a score of close to 4, then you might just hit the threshold for suffering and not suffering. So for a small subgroup of patients, because of this nonlinear correlation, it might be beneficial.
Now, I think that a problem which most people researching tinnitus at the moment actually have is they focus too much on these subjective measures of suffering. Now, tinnitus suffering is very important, but the thing is that people can suffer without tinnitus, and there were results in the trial of a person's objective decrease, an insane objective decrease actually, of 24 decibels, and he had a 16 to 18 point increase in TFI. That's ridiculous. How can this data even be interpreted adequately? Now, this is the reason why a person who is researching tinnitus needs to focus on objective measures if we're talking about tinnitus reduction, because for the vast amount or the vast majority of people, an objective reduction in tinnitus will mean that their TFI and THI scores, or their emotional state, their subjective emotional state, will recover following it. So I think that studies that address purely TFI and THI, they are not adequate for tinnitus studies, because a person's emotional state can actually fluctuate wildly due to external factors, or due to just a person's personal factors as well, like how anxious they are, for example. I mean, if we talk about this guy who had a 24 decibel reduction in tinnitus, which is insane, and had an increase in TFI, what if his mom died or something like that? What if something else happened? What if he's having a tough time at work? What if he is just, overall, having consistent issues in his life that increase his emotional distress regardless of the tinnitus treatment that he is receiving? And that's the biggest problem with TFI and THI. Even when you are studying something like the effects of certain medications on tinnitus, or combinations of meds on tinnitus, a person's emotional state will be severely affected by these things. So whether or not a med cocktail, for example, can be considered to be a viable tinnitus treatment, well, it certainly can improve a person's emotional state, just like cognitive behavioral therapy can improve a person's emotional state. I mean, for example, right now I have tinnitus that cannot even be masked by 100 decibel waterfalls. Do I have any distress? No, I do not. Would I like my tinnitus to decrease objectively? Yes, I would. And these things cannot be grouped together. And De Ridder does make an excellent point that the FDI did force Susan Shore to do these subjective measures to have the chance of approval in the future of her device. But that does not mean that these TFI and THI measures should be considered the main driving factor of whether or not a treatment is effective at decreasing objective volume of tinnitus. I mean, generally speaking, if a person can decrease their objective volume of tinnitus, their emotional state obviously will improve. And if a person's emotional state still does not improve with an objective decrease in tinnitus volume, then they have other issues they need to take care of, like their anxiety or something like that. Or maybe they need to control their stress better in their life. But this has nothing to do with tinnitus whatsoever. There are many numerous external factors that can be at play here, like I mentioned before, and the person needs to visit a therapist regardless of this.
Now, if you look at the tongue and auditory stimulation, then these results are very intriguing, and because they compare um, the 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 pairing of sounds and tongue stimulation, and irrespective of what you do, you get a benefit, which is 13 points. But there is no difference whether you pair it or you don't pair it. It seems that if you modify the somatosensory cortex and the auditory cortex, you get a benefit. And this is why they had to do a study for the FDA to get accepted in the US, where they first had to do an auditory stimulus, see what benefit there was, and then add the tongue stimulation afterwards. And they needed to have clear superiority of the combined stimulation versus only the tongue stimulation. And because they had this benefit, irrespective of whether it followed the mechanism, because if it's mechanism based, you would say only with a specific pairing it should be better, but it was not. It was better with whatever way sound and the sound and the electrical stimulation of the tongue was spared. So, of course, the tongue stimulates the trigeminal nerve, whereas Susan Shores stimulates the C2 nerve. But these two nerves do get into the brainstem, and they extend into the spinal cord to the level of C2. They form one big nucleus. So the trigeminal and the C2 nerve are integrated at the level of the brainstem. So it's not surprising that both seem to have some benefit.
Now, I actually mentioned this in the Q&A itself, but I'd like to address this again. The issue with Neuromod's trial is that they did not have a placebo control group, and that is a massive issue. And if they compared later on the auditory only and the tongue stimulation combined with auditory later on, it does not mean or guarantee that this is not placebo, because as I did mention in the Q&A, Lanier was all over the news, and everybody knew what Lanier was. Everybody in the US knew what Lanier was. We had people like going to Ireland to get it. So if you have people knowing that they are receiving the actual treatment, which is the tongue stimulation and the auditory stimulation, obviously there will be a placebo effect, or their TFI and THI measures are improved, or they're significantly more, not even significantly better, because if you see in the graph that de Ridder is presenting, the differences are almost just non-existent. It's like almost like what? It's like 1 point of a difference in TFI and THI. Not to mention, Lanier's device does not follow the principles of spike timing dependent plasticity. Long-term depression cannot be induced reliably with how their device currently is set up, with the Bluetooth headphones introducing a lot of latency, and not to mention their noise stimulation being constant instead of millisecond bursts like in the Susan Shores device, to provide the adequate postsynaptic spikes required for long-term depression. This basically just negates the efficacy of the device for tinnitus reduction volume in general. Now, all of this was mentioned in the Q&A, and de Ridder does actually say that later on in the Q&A that Neuromod's practices of achieving TFI and THI reduction just to kind of display to the FDA that their device does something, instead of actually focusing on the efficacy of tinnitus reduction, and Neuromod did actually change their presentation later on to say that the device does not decrease volume. It's a habituation device that retrains the brain or something like that, which is nonsense, by the way. It's all placebo. And de Ridder does say that this is deplorable later on in the Q&A session. So obviously people do see and understand that Neuromod Linear does actually kind of seem like it's placebo, and it actually is placebo. So it is no more than placebo. And I recommend everybody to watch the full Q&A session, or maybe specifically this section if you're interested. Now, I don't fully agree with de Ridder on many of these aspects, but keep in mind that de Ridder's main focus of tinnitus research and tinnitus treatment research is addressing the tinnitus-related distress or suffering that is induced by tinnitus. Now, this is a viable method, actually, I think, a very viable method for addressing people's tinnitus, but in general, I think that for future tinnitus studies that actually focus on the objective decrease in tinnitus volume, such interventions or such methods like loudness matching, minimum masking level, etc., absolutely must be involved in the trials. And as de Ridder did mention on the Q&A, a combined approach is necessary, and I fully agree with him. However, if tinnitus is decreased objectively, and tinnitus-related distress will follow eventually. And if a person has issues with their emotional state even after objective tinnitus volume decrease, then they need to address it separately. They need to address it with cognitive behavioral therapy. They need to address it with medications, for example. Now, unfortunately, spike timing dependent plasticity, specifically long-term depression, the efficacy of this does actually depend a lot on the stability of neurotransmitters and just, everything related to that, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video. So combining this treatment like bisensory neuromodulation together with medications will actually negate the efficacy of the device. So what people should do is they should still address all of this. And I'm sure people who have insane anxiety or just any anxiety disorders, I'm sure that their anxiety will decrease with the objective volume decrease. But if their anxiety does not decrease with objective volume decrease, which is what matters for most people, they need more strict, or they need more interventions in general to address their anxiety, regardless of the tinnitus related distress. Definitely do watch the full Q&A in the description below and in the pinned comment. We cover a lot of very interesting topics, and de Ridder is very obviously a very knowledgeable specialist in this area. And I have immense respect for him devoting his time and devoting his, life to the research of tinnitus-related suffering. I think it's a very, very excellent area of research, and it definitely should be addressed for those more severe suffering-related individuals, I guess you could say. A lot of the time, actually, people who have these anxiety disorders and people who suffer a lot from their tinnitus, even if they do see an objective decrease, they still might not have a decrease in their THI or TFI in general. Like a person who has, more mild tinnitus he can still have an objective decrease. But for example, if by the end of the treatment sessions, or the treatment in general, like at the end of the 6 weeks, if this person still does not have full suppression, this can actually cause them to become more anxious, like regardless. Like, I mean, for example, he thinks, oh, I thought I was going to have my tinnitus like removed. I thought it was going to be gone, and this can actually really cause immense distress. And that shows the importance of de Ritter's research for these types of people. That's about it what I want to say for today. So yeah.